Okay, nice. Right, the floor is yours.
I would like to check if I'm just audible.
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Okay. I go by he, him pronouns. All right. Uh, Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christian Menon. I'm the first speaker. I'll be defining the motion and as well as representing the government's case by saying the points. Our second speaker, Nitwesh, will be rebutting the opposition as well as doing infused rebuttals, which are rebuttals which include our own points, as well as including other points which have been missed out by me. Our third speaker, Abia, our whip, will be fully doing the oppositions or maybe including points that have not been stated. And Nitwesh will be doing our reply speech, in which he will sum up the government's case as to why we won the debate. Okay, I'll start off by defining the motion. We can split the motion up into several key terms. The first one being media. So media is simply news. The second will be published information. So published information simply is the release of details of certain events. Thirdly will be the deceased in a tragedy. These are the people who have passed away after a devastating event. Explicit permission, which is the next one, is clearly stated consent. And lastly is family. Family are the relatives of the deceased. So to bring all the words together again, this house believes that news should only release details of certain events regarding people who have passed away in a devastating event only after clearly stated consent from the relatives of the deceased. I finished with the definition and now I'll be moving on to the points. The first point will be privacy. So the death of an individual is a very, very sensitive matter. We should allow the families to take time and settle down. And hence, only after specific, explicit permission should they be, media should be allowed to release this information. Let me give you an example. Let's say a family is mourning the daughter, one of their daughters who've passed away in a very tragic event. And let's say on the day of their mourning, they decide to open up the television and they decide to look on the news. And then they see the daughter's name being used openly, reminding them of the tragedies, reminding them of the fact that their daughter went through such a tragic event. Can you say that that is fair to the family without their permission, just randomly and openly being used on television? Do you think that is fair? I do not think that is fair. And this house certainly does not believe that is fair. My second point will be cultural sensitivity. So different cultures and religions may have different traditions. We should first acknowledge this. The second we should do is accept this. And the third thing we should do is respect it. Media should be respecting of people's traditions and their religions. So only after explicit permission should media publish this information, because there may be certain ceremonies, certain rituals that may occur first before they want the name to be passed along all these different media companies. The third point we have is safety. So safety. If permission is not given, details such as sensitive data, name, age, sex, religious views, political views, stuff like this of the deceased family member may be used by the public, by bad people of the public. If the opposition says that there is no such thing as bad people in the public, then you are wrong, because there are bad people in the public and they may use this to harm the family. Example, they may do prank calls, they may vandalize the house, who knows? There are lots of different chances for harm to be given to the family. So my fourth point will be that media can exploit this news. So fake news is a very big thing in today's society. The name of the deceased, especially with social media, where things go viral and news spreads like wildfire, name of the deceased may be passed around too easily and too fast. And this may cause the discomfort of the family and may potentially create a bad reputation surrounding the family and their name, as well as the name of the deceased. Having someone's name thrown around so loosely loses respect for the family. And this puts the family at dis-ease and disrespects the name of the dead. My fifth point will be balance. Journalism takes into account both the interest of the public and balancing that by taking into consideration the family's right to privacy. Therefore, the media should definitely take into account the explicit permission of the family before they loosely throw around the names of the deceased. Lastly, by allowing media to publish only after explicit permission, it removes any rumors or sensational headlines that media companies tend to make. Tend to make, meaning they like to make. And this ensures that only verified and authentic details of certain tragedies are shared with the public. Now, to conclude, these are the points that we feel that the government uses to support this motion. So thank you very much. And this is how I'd like to conclude. Yep.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite leader of opposition.
Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The media exists to be a transparent platform for the public to obtain information easily and should not be censored in any way. Firstly, I'll start with my setup. This debate is about whether we should publish information about the disease in the media. There are two paths of victory for our side of the house today. Firstly, why transparency is the obligation of the media, and secondly, that it is in the public's interest to obtain these kind of information. The government's counterfactual is that the debate is likely to be reasonable, where in most cases, families are unlikely to agree to post these information. Because if most of them give permission, that means that the amount of information is symmetrical on both sides and there is no delta in the debate. There are few incentives for them to not permit the media to publish information about the deceased family. Firstly, on privacy, because these families don't want their personal information to be posted online. And secondly, about emotional impact, because they do not want to see their loved ones' tragedy being spread among the public. But even in government's best case, where some families do give permission, it will likely be inefficient, and side government has conceded this in their first argument, because the family needs time to recover from the traumatic incident. For example, if their child died in front of their eyes, or that they didn't expect their mother to pass away so suddenly. So if government truly values the emotion of the families, they will need to wait until a certain time to obtain consent, which means the info will be only published quite some time later, which dilutes the urgency of the news. Our comparative is that we will be posting this information online about the deceased people, even if their families do not agree. These information will be obtained from forensics.
POI.
No, thank you. Or investigations from the police, etc. We will still have things like investigative journalism. Therefore, the information on our side is likely to be more accurate. Before moving on into my arguments, I'll first give some responses to the Prime Minister. Firstly, they mentioned about cultural sensitivity and how the media should respect that. However, we tell you that this cultural sensitivity has nothing to do with the media, because the media would not be posting about rituals or the person's religious habits. Instead, they'll be posting about how the tragedy happened, or the process of that tragedy. So what triggered that thing to happen and caused the person to die, right? They won't be posting about how the person does their religious rituals and stuff like that. They also mention how people will spread fake news on our side. However, we're going to flip this point by saying on your side, fake news is more likely to spread because of how the media is not posting these content, and it will cause less transparency within the media. So people are more likely to come out with fake information and spread it. Okay. Now on to my arguments. I have two main arguments in my speech today. Firstly, the obligation of the media, and secondly, why is it in the public's interest to obtain these kind of information? So for the first argument, on our principal argument, why is it the obligation of the media? Because The media is supposed to provide information in the public's interest and to generate discourse about it. The purpose of the media existing is to allow people to know what is going on in all parts of the world and be aware of current affairs that might affect these people in some way. It can be domestic or international, and it's just to let people know what's going on around them. And the media can also be used to advertise or garner attention. So the second layer to this is why the media shouldn't be censored. Firstly, what is the harm of selectively censoring parts of the media? We tell you that if you censor parts of the media, it will let you walk down a slippery slope where you open up manipulation in the media. It creates a trend and normalizes the media censoring content, which means that the media will become a platform for non-transparency. This will cause more misinformation to spread, or even worse, it will hide important information from them. This will also cause the state or rich companies being able to abuse their power to censor the media. For example, things that happens behind the scenes in politics, like corruption. All of this will impact people's daily lives, their choices, and their perspective on the world. That's why we tell you that censoring the media is bad. And our third layer to this argument is the weighing against consent. We tell you that a lot of current state policies go against your consent as well, because consent is not absolute in all cases. It overrides social utility most of the these state policies override social utility most of the time. For example, people did not consent to be restricted by these laws, right? These laws exist to restrict you from doing something for a larger societal benefit, and the state does not need to get your consent where they implement laws. For example, when you need to submit income tax or financial transaction. Therefore, we think that we win against our principle is more important, and we win against the principle of consent. And secondly, our pragmatic argument is why it is in the public's interest to obtain these kind of information. Firstly, we need to talk about what these tragedies are. It looks like accidents, like road accidents or plane accidents where the plane crashes. Secondly, it looks like natural disasters like flash floods and earthquakes. And thirdly, it could be crimes like murder, domestic abuse, kidnapping, or violence. All of these examples I've given are considered a tragedy because people die in them, right? And the public wants to know about these information because society has given importance to life. Therefore, if someone dies, it is a big issue. The impacts of this is number one, dominant portrayal. Because if people see a lot of these news occurring, it makes a lot more people aware of these things, and therefore they will take more measures to protect themselves. Secondly, it's the attention on these issues. No, thank you. Because the victim's identity is crucial to society, because the person could be from a minority group, such as a person of color or someone from the LGBTQ community. Therefore, it allows people to know about these communities and garner more attention on them. And with all those reasons, very proud to propose. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Just to within the time frame, which is the first until the 6 minute, more than that is a protected time. So please respect the protected time given. With that being said, Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, sorry, just 1 minute to get my timer ready. Meanwhile, I'd like to check if I am both audible and visible.
You're loud and clear. The floor is yours.
Okay, before I begin, I'd like to state that I use he, him pronouns, and I'll only be taking into account of verbal POIs. I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, everybody, and today government is proud to participate in this debate. I would like to take my role in first doing rebuttals and then continuing on with rebuttals, but rebuttals that include our own points and then further on elaborating on our points. So to begin with rebuttals, the first point I would like to talk about that the first speaker has mentioned is the time factor. The first speaker has stated that in order to get explicit permission of the family, this would take time, as we have mentioned, to do certain cultural and religious beliefs and perform certain rituals. And taking this into account, there will be a time factor that leads to a delay in the release of information. However, we believe that you fail to consider that you create a false impression that media is the only source of information. What it is that media is the only source of information to the public and to the community. However, this information can still be recorded in government archives. There still exists an archival existence of this information. So it is not like it is being swept under and we're waiting a long period to take an act on this. Things such as death certificates and the registration of their debts do exist. So their debts are being taken into account. They're just not being publicized for everyone to look at and criticize. So therefore, we believe that your point on time factor, however valid with the media, is invalid as you fail to add depth to it and consider that archivals from the government and etc. do exist. And I'll be further talking about why the media, about that point later on. Secondly, the first speaker talks a lot about transparency and the censoration of information. While you are correct, yes, we do not want to censor information. You have falsely taken and twisted our points. As the motion states, the media will only publish information about the deceased. I'd like to repeat that, about the deceased with permission, explicit permission from the family. This does not mean the censoration of the event that has actually taken place. We can still post about the death, we can still make news about the death of people without directly involving them. It is possible to protect their identity, to protect their privacy, while still releasing crucial information to the public. The public does not need to know about the name, about their address, about the sex, about the age, etc., of the individual without permission from the family. Yes, they do have the right to know it, but who holds the higher right in this scenario? Some random person or family, blood and family of the deceased? We believe that it should be the blood and family. Therefore, there will not be censoration. This is not censored information. Information is still being uploaded. To further add depth to that point, we are still, like I've mentioned, archiving their debts. We are still taking into account their debts. It is not being swept under the table. And as for public interest, as you have constantly mentioned, we believe that there should be a balance. So now I'll be moving on to rebuttals infused with our own points. As we have mentioned about balance, it should take into account of not only the public, but also the familial factors. Both of them should exist in a point where both of them are happy to an extent. Therefore, we're not saying that we do not release information. We do release information whilst also protecting the families. This allows us to come to a point of balance where the families are at peace with the death of their loved ones, and the public are informed about such tragedies and how to avoid them in the future, etc. Next, you talked about fake news and flipped it onto us, that not posting it is indeed fake news. But once again, this is very similar to your point about censoring, that we are not blocking out certain information. We are not, to rephrase, we are not completely changing that information. All we're doing is protecting the identity of a being in order to give families space and in order to give them processing time, as you have mentioned, is crucial. Later on, we can release news about this person, but the first news that needs to come out, that's most important, is informing about the tragedy itself, but not the people. It's more about the tragedy. You have failed to consider the familial concerns and have focused too much on the public, whereas the government has taken into account, as I've mentioned with balance, both the public and the familial concerns. And this is why we believe that there should be explicit permission from the family while we still post actual information about the tragedy without causing harm and throwing their name in disinterest and losing the reputation, as first speaker Christian has mentioned. So now to add on to that, by moving on to some of our own points, while still rebutting, is, as I've mentioned, with balance and with misinformation, you have flipped it onto us, but that is completely wrong, because media can very easily exploit news. But as I've mentioned, archives do not. Media can create headlines, twist words, twist scenarios in order to create a sort of appealing news, something that will gauge the interest of the public, something that will wow, something that is a wow factor, a selling factor. Because in the end, not only do media companies want to inform, they want to make a profit. And so what are they going to consider here? They're going to consider both. They're not just going to consider information. Therefore, we have to be considering the family and the deceased and putting them at a safe area too. Secondly, we have seen countless examples very recently as well with the pandemic, especially on social media, not just news, actual news such as BBC, CNN, etc. Therefore, there can be the widespread of multiple wrong things, multiple false information, creating false impressions, misleading the community, in fact, and therefore destroying the reputation of the family's loved ones, creating their name in a bad aura, which is already a dim setting due to cruel, grimy, just deaths that are not anyone should witness within tragedies. Therefore, this house strongly believes that we are not censoring, we are not being untransparent. We are just taking into concern not only the public, but also the family and the familial concerns. And therefore, we should arrive at a point of balance where everyone is considered, news is released, families are protected, archives are kept, and explicit permission must be received from families before the media posts any public information about the deceased, specifically on the deceased. And with that, that is why government believes that is, as I've mentioned, that explicit permission is required. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite the Deputy Prime Minister. I mean the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
All right. Give me a few seconds to start my time. My preferred gender pronouns are she, her, and I prefer verbal POIs. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Side government has given us a laundry list of why it's harmful to not obtain permission from family of deceased. The sad thing is that most of them are literally one-liners with little to no analysis behind it. On the comparative, we have given you clear analysis to back up both arguments. So far, we've given two things to you. Firstly, what is the media's obligation and why the media shouldn't be censored? Secondly, why is it in the public's interest to obtain this kind of information and why it's particularly important to them? We think that on this case, we think that side government automatically falls out in this debate because there's literally no backing up to the case at all. Before I move on to my responses, I'd like to do some reorientation in this debate because I think the debate so far coming from side government has been quite messy because there are way too many assertions being thrown by side government and way too many arguments that are not backed up by any analysis. Let me help them to clarify what is their burden in this debate. Their burden of proof is to, number one, prove the value of consent from the family, and secondly, to prove why the media is still able to fulfill its obligation of providing full information in the public's interest. None of this burden is fulfilled because they give you far-fetched arguments about things like cultural sensitivity and fake news. Number one, in terms of cultural sensitivity, because they told us that there may be some rituals that is being carried out by the family, right? Number one, I think it's just very unclear as to why it is important in this debate at all. And secondly, it's just very nuanced because it's way too specific to have them to say this in this debate, right? And it also harms their case because it narrows down their case down a lot because not all families or like not all individuals just have this kind of rituals or like have these rituals that take a very long time to carry out, right? So it's just very specific and it's not very important in this debate. They have to debate on a more reasonable and realistic ground. Secondly, in terms of fake news itself, I just think that it's much more likely on your side because number one, we have already preempted it from first in setup. We are telling you that we are going to use information that we have obtained from the forensics or like investigation from the police forces or like collaboration between different parties to obtain as accurate as possible information for the news on the media outlets to be published to the public, right? You can also interview the families. It's just that we are not obtaining their permission on our side of the house. Therefore, we already preempted to you that we are still going to have accurate information on our side of the house. Secondly, I just think that speculation is way more likely on your side of the house, because when something big happens in your country, like maybe there's a very big accident that happened in some area, or when there's a natural disaster that happened, and no media platform is actually talking about it in the short term, it will generate speculation within the country itself. It causes more rumors because people just don't know what is actually happening, and they make up things to believe. And more information is going to misinformation is going to happen on your side of the house due to the lack of transparency. It's also very harmful because it actually threatens the safety of the citizens, right? Because it's the veil of safety that is removed from your side of the house, because you are not giving your citizens an explanation as to what is actually happening.
POI.
And therefore, I'll take it later, please don't heckle. And therefore, it just means that these citizens are much more likely to feel unsafe in their very own country on your side of the house. Lastly, then, I just think that in the extreme, where the media is truly bad, it is literally the same media on their side of the house, right? Therefore, they must assume that the media is functional to some extent in this debate in order for this debate to function, right? Before moving on to my responses, yeah, I'll take a point.
Are you trying to suggest that news cannot be reported without specific details of each and every victim of the tragedy?
I'll explain this later, but I just think that it's very harmful to your case if you are taking a soft stance on saying that this is not censorship at all, because it literally cuts down a lot of your benefits on your side of the house. Now, moving on to talk about like some responses that may be predictable in this debate. First of all, they told us about the privacy of the family themselves, and they need some time to recover from the traumatic incident in order to like have permission or something like that. Number one, it just means that they consider to the fact that these families do need to take some time to settle down and in order to provide permission for the media outlets to publish certain informations, right? This actually means inefficient publish of the information. And why is this harm? Number one, because of the sense of urgency, right? Because the media, the news itself is most urgent and like perceived by the public when it's published immediately. Because if the thing has already happened sometime after and then you only publish it, it means that there's not as much urgency given or associated to this particular information. For example, when such a big thing happened, like for example, an accident happened in certain areas, it just means that when people want to know more about it, you don't have the information to provide on your side of the house. Therefore, it also means that it threatens public safety, because people are actually speculating a lot of things and they just don't have an accurate answer that's provided by the media or the government, and therefore they think that their area is just not safe at all. And this is particularly harmful because this debate is also about the public and also about your citizens, right? Because the audience, these are the audience of the media itself who are consuming this kind of news and information. Therefore, tell you that you ought to consider them. Secondly, they told us that the media is not the only avenue to get information, because you also have archives, and this is not censorship. Number one, I want to say that it's untrue at all, because media is the biggest avenue through which you get information. Because if you don't have media, you don't have the news, where at all are you going to like get this kind of information? There's no alternatives provided by state government, right? Secondly, if they say that they'll keep the information in archives, but and then they say that they're not letting public to access, there's literally no value of you keeping this kind of information at all. The value only exists on our side of the house, where we publish information for the public who are interested in it, right? Now let's deal with the censorship like mitigation from their side of the house. Number one, it's just a very soft stance for them to take, because it carves out a lot of the value of the information. It's not only about the gender or age of the victim that we are talking in this debate. It's about their background and the process of tragedy that may be intertwined with their own personal information. For example, maybe this person is he is a racial minority who suffers from police brutality. You need to publish information about his background, about like his racial background and things like that, in order for you to fully like publish the entire process of a tragedy, right? Because if not, it just means censorship, and it opens up the media outlet from being like twisted and manipulated by certain authorities, right? What is censorship back then? Number one, you are walking down a very slippery slope when you open up manipulation in media, and this ought not to happen. It's already said. This ought not to happen, because the media's obligation is to provide full and free information for the public to access in their own interest, for example, for self-defense or safety. Secondly, it opens up the rich authorities to censor the media itself. For example, it just means that investigative journalism on your side of the house is just way less effective, because if you are saying that you are able to selectively censor some parts of the media, I just think that it means that those authority can select parts where they want to publish and where they are not. Even if it doesn't happen right now, I just think that you are setting a very bad precedence, and this is very likely to happen in the future. Therefore, we tell you that we are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. I'd like to emphasize again to please POI within the time frame given. I have already put an effort to indicate the timestamp within the first and second 6 minutes in the chat box. So please don't POI after 6 minutes. It's very disrespectful to other speaker who is trying their best to conclude their speech. I heavily emphasize this. With that being said, opt with, Golf with.
Thank you. Just give me a moment. I'm setting up my timer. All right. Good morning. And good morning to everyone present, the government, the opposition, and the adjudicators. Thank you for being here today. I'm the third speaker for the government team. Before I start, I would like to ask if I can be heard clearly.
You're loud and clear, the floor is yours.
All right, awesome. To outline, I go by he, him pronouns, and I prefer verbal POIs. Right. So I'd like to begin my case today by mentioning one statement. Privacy is power. And I'd like to remind you that this power, privacy, is a basic human right and is fundamental to the joyous lives of those who stand on this planet. The way I see it, this debate is not a debate about how to go about reporting the passing of individuals. No, absolutely not. Today's debate is the fight against privacy and public interest. And we believe that our base argument that encouraging consent-based reporting is the perfect balance of both confidentiality and public interest. You might bring out the topic of timeliness in terms of reporting such news, but what the opposition fails to understand is that while timely reporting is important, it should not come at the expense of families' grief and privacy. Truly responsible reporting would take this into account. And I'd like to reiterate, this House believes that consent-based reporting is responsible reporting. And yes, while the public does have an interest in information like this, it's very important to achieve a balance between public interest and familial privacy. Without such consent, the privacy of the family is completely ignored, and this just places the grieving family on the back foot. Remember, the goal is not to misinform the public, which the opposition believes so. The goal is to take into account the emotions of the family that has suffered this loss and give them a little breathing space to get back on their feet. I shouldn't need to explain this because this is elementary. And I can give countless syllogisms, but I'll make a syllogism for the chair to understand why I think it's obvious for the media to consider the explicit permission of the family. Any human right, such as gender or opinions or political standpoints, are all protected under the basic human courtesy of consent, right? We all agree on this. And we also agree that privacy is a human right. So clearly, it's easy to understand that privacy demands the shade of consent. You can't just strip that away under the overgeneralized statement being, oh, the public needs to know such information, which in itself is a flawed argument, which I'll get back to later on. And I'd like to highlight, privacy is something that's given to the people and to the public. Before taking it away, before a media organization walks in and reports tabloid journalism and strips a family's confidentiality, is it really that hard to wait for the explicit consent of this family? We don't think so. The opposition also fails to understand that consent-based reporting is not censorship in any form. It's not censorship of data. It's only the delayed release of such sensitive information that's taking place. Nothing gets censored at all. And to add, the opposition house forgets that the media is obviously not the only source of information. And those sources adequately feed public knowledge. You might think that media is important, but it's important to you. What about the countless other individuals that walk on this planet? Sources such as official statements, death certificates, independent organizations and corporations and their reporting. And there's so many other reliable sources. These are all places where you can get factual evidence and obtain information without invading the family's basic right to privacy. There's your alternatives. And the media is supposed to say what goes on around the world, says your first speaker. And I say you're right. That's what it's supposed to do. And that's what it can do. Your first speaker constantly suggests that our argument is on a slippery slope, when in reality, they fail to understand that they are standing on this very slippery slope. The way I see it, the opposition's argument centers on one base argument, that our stance suggests a partial censorship of media, of knowledge. And again, that's not true. I feel like a broken record in reiterating that this is an assumption. And time again, deaths of figures such as John F. Kennedy and so many other influential political leaders and individuals of society, they have been reported by the media several hours after the tragic event. Why? To protect the people, the same way consent-based reporting does so. Your pragmatic argument is also completely unrelated to the matter that we discussed in today's debate. Your first speaker mentions how visibility is given to LGBT communities and other wildly indirect arguments that do not have anything to add on to the topic of consent-based journalism. So maybe we should all take a break to allow the opposition to rethink their flawed arguments and come up with facts that truly speak to today's crucial debate, which I believe that the government team has done so. And one more thing, there are over 4,000 recognized religions in the world. The opposition expects us to give an example, to give the House an example as to how traditions require grieving families to take time for themselves and delay reporting of news. We can't, and that's the point. Just like us three individuals, neither can the media truly understand how family would like to proceed with the rituals of an individual's passing. So it's only fair to give these very families the say as to how they'd like to convey the passing of their loved ones. And that's another fundamental human right, allowing people to practice the cultures and traditions they seek to worship. And that's very important. Your second speaker says that these traditions are time consuming, which again is an assumption, so I shall very politely ignore. But she also says that they aren't important. I ask you, why? Why do you say that? You make such statements, but don't explain them at all. You can't just say something's not important. Back it up with facts like we are doing so. And again, this is just unfair and most importantly, unjust to the crucial matter we debate on today. And I feel that visibly displays to the chair the incompetency in the argumentation on the opposition side. And that sums up most of my rebuttals to your arguments. By allowing the media to publish information, you must understand, using explicit permission of the family cracks down on rumors, on sensational headlines that media companies just love to make, ensuring that only verified, authentic details of the tragic event are shared with the public. That's important, as media can exploit this news. It's important to make sure that at the end of the day, the public get the right source of information at the right time. And with that, I think I, the third speaker, have justifiably suggested why our debate today is a winning one. A winning one for the people and a winning one for the privacy of the people. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite the Gulf Whip.
Okay, so I prefer verbal POIs, and I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So before I move on to the issues that's happening in this debate, I'll first give one main response to side government, right? So the main thing that we get from the whole government case today is that they want to balance between releasing information through the media and also getting the family's consent, right? But we'd like to point out that side government have gave us a bunch of no analysis backed up arguments, but they dropped most of them, and so we will focus on arguing on the privacy and consent of the families, right? So we will focus on responding to this. We tell that it is unreasonable for side government to say that they can balance up both sides, right? Because they tell us that they will still release the information, but with the family's consent. But we tell that it is unlikely for the families to consent because, firstly, because of, as they mentioned, privacy, and second, because of the emotional trauma, right? So the government did not prove the likelihood for the families to consent to it. And no consent means that nothing regarding these kinds of tragedies and news are going to be known by the public, right? And we tell that there's two harms to this. Where the public don't know anything, this means that the public does not know what is happening around them. For example, like political issues that may be crucial to them, because like the tragedies may be something related to politics as well, right? And secondly, there's going to be a decrease in the societal safety because people are unable to know about the tragedies that's happening around them. And that means that they are unable to like protect themselves. And secondly, they tell us that they have other alternatives, right? But we tell you that most people in status quo consume news from the media and not from like death certificates and like records from like random companies. So we don't see how their alternatives is better. So what is our weighing here, right? So we are weighing off the consent of the families because we think that it is the public utility is more important, right? Because as my first speaker has already mentioned on how like state policies goes against your consent as well, and consent overrides social utility most of the times. This means that the family's interest on it is like in the family's interest on like preventing the same tragedy from happening, right? We tell you that our way here is that the same thing applies here because like not all when the state implements certain policy, they don't get like the everyone in the state's consent, right? And it's for like the public good. So we tell that the same thing applies here because what we're trying to do is for like the public good. So moving on to the clash, which is like what is in the best interest of the public, right? So 3 reasons to why side governments wants to have family consent. Firstly, which is privacy, but they did not engage with our stance on urgency, and they tell us that media is not the only source to get like information because like the government will still have an archive of it. But my dear has already responded to that, saying that it's the time factor of urgency and it makes no sense for the government to just keep it to themselves because the public will know anyway. Secondly, they tell us about cultural sensitivity, and my dear has also responded to that. And third thing is on safety, right? We tell that there's societal safety on our side as well because the media will not be focusing on the personal information of the disease, like for example, their address or their age, height, etc. Because it is not what is important in the tragedy, right? What is important in the tragedy itself is that even if some personal information is posted, we think that the information is not sufficient for people to target and harm the family. Even if it does happen, it's the minority case and it's very unlikely to happen anyways, because what people wants to focus on is on the tragedy itself and not like the identity of the victim, right? So the issue here is whether or not we should get the family's consent, right? On our side, we like to trade off. We are willing to trade off the consent of the families for the sake of the public utility, right? And why is this still justifiable? Because side government tells us about the emotions of the families and that they need time to grieve, right? My response to this is that families are able to heal even if the disease tragedy is posted on the media. Because firstly, because of the empathy from public, when people read about these news on the internet or through other media platforms, the public is likely to feel empathy for the family's loss. The public values life and sees death as a significant issue. Therefore, they will post like comforting, empathetic comments regarding those posts and also like comforting words towards the families, right? Therefore, these families are able to feel the sympathy from the public and heal. Secondly, is about facing reality, right? When the families see these, like that disease, families of everywhere over on the news, they are more likely to be able to move on because they will not be avoiding reality anymore, right? When someone as close as your family dies tragically, many will be in denial and refuse to face reality because the family falls into the rabbit hole of depression and they'll never like accept their loss because of like the emotional grief, right? But with the media, we tell that the family will more likely recognize that tragedy occurs and like recognize that life goes on, and so they will have like no choice to move on and thus being able to heal better, right? Therefore, we have proven to you that these emotions of families will still be protected even after posting about the disease. It is the media's obligation and right to post transparent and accurate information about important tragedies that will impact the everyday lives of the people. So it is justifiable to share without the consent of the family. So moving on to the weighing, which is on side government's best case, right? Where all families do give their consent to publish their information. So we tell that number one, this is an ineffective way because you need to wait until the families go through the pain and finally willing to consent. But by then the urgency of this issue is like not there anymore, and like even though it's known by the public, there's no urgency in it. And secondly, we tell that the state implements laws without your consent, which is already explained in previous speeches, because we tell that the purpose of law existing is for the public good, right? It is to protect the public. So the same thing works here, because letting the public be aware about this tragedy is for their own good. For number one, self-protection, and number two, to simply garner attention, right? This means that there will be like more public safety on our side of the house, because people are able to know what tragedy is happening around them and like try to protect themselves when they're like outside in society, right? Well, on our worst case, where the public knows too much information about the family, or like the families are like happy about the media like releasing their deceased family information without their consent. But we tell you that even though this is our worst case, but we tell you that the public utility still overrides the consent of the family, and we're willing to trade that off, because number one, because of the media's obligation to spread the news, to garner attention for the public, to let public be more like self-aware on what is happening around them. And secondly, it's just in the public interest to get these informations right, as explained by my previous speakers already. So with all those above reasons, we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. To conclude the case from the opposition, I'd like to invite the opposition reply.
All right. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. After 21 minutes of their speeches, side government still failed to realize what is the crux of the debate. The debate is essentially about whether is consent important and how important the information that you are going to censor on your side is to the public, right? There are a few unimportant things that were thrown out by side government, and I would like to clear that up before I move on to my issues. Firstly, they talk about the means to access information. Basically, they told us that there are other means for them to access information. For example, death certificates and certain records from like private companies, etc. Number one, in order for this to work, they have to provide is a more reliable source of information, right? Because the media's obligation is literally to have to verify information. For example, they need to obtain information from forensics or like investigations from the police in order to publish this kind of information. I just think that it's very unclear as to why it is likely for you to have better sources of information on your side of the house. Secondly, it is also important for them to prove why people would likely to turn to this kind of sources instead of the media, because right now in status quo, everyone consumes the media and obtain information from this kind of thing. Therefore, the media is the biggest avenue through which they are able to obtain accurate information, and therefore this hurts their case, because that means that their alternative is not even working. Secondly, about the exploitation and fake news itself, I just think that I've already responded to this in my speech just now. Right? So fake news is not really important in this debate, because if the media that operates on both sides of the house is literally the same media, if the media is so corrupted or so bad or is so manipulative or exploited, I just think that it's still the same media that is going to operate on your side of the house. But even if you say that media is different somehow, I just think that it's far more likely for fake news or things like exploitation to happen on your side of the house, given that speculation is much more likely when you don't have an accurate answer to provide to the public when they are asking and questioning about the tragedies that actually happen, right? Because it is when you are not publishing certain information and you're hiding certain information from the public, then they are going to simply add on their opinions and speculate in the public spectrum. Thirdly, about cultural rituals itself, we are not even banning people from having cultural rituals. Therefore, I just think that it's not very important. And also because cultural rituals itself is a very nuanced part in the debate, if they want to debate on this route, I just think that they are cutting down a lot of their benefits, because it's way too specific in this case, right? However, what are the important issues then on this debate? Firstly, in terms of principle itself, our principle on our side of the house is about the obligation of media. This directly deals with the first important question in this debate about whether content is actually important. because we tell you that the obligation of media itself is to provide information for the public in the public's interest. For example, they want to know more about certain issues that may affect their own safety. Therefore, we tell you that also because consent is oftentimes overridden by a lot of things. For example, most of the laws that exist currently in status quo are overriding your consent as well, because you did not consent to have your freedom of choice or whatever being like stripped off or like being restricted in certain cases. Because the government does this, they implement laws in order to restrict certain rights for them to protect like greater good of society, right? Therefore, in this parallel, then we tell that privacy can be traded off on our house because the utility of society is far greater, which is for them to gain awareness on certain things that may affect themselves, and also to gain awareness on things that are important, for example, police brutality, that is necessary for them to know through like publishing the information about the disease, right? Secondly, about the public interest of media, I just think it's a very legitimate concern because it's literally something that is concerning their lives, because society values lives, and if someone dies, is indeed a big problem, right? There are a couple of impacts that were undealt by the government. Number one, the dominant portrayal of like the same news occurring, it just makes people more aware and even more importance to these kind of issues. Secondly, the attention given to important issues about things like their racial identity or like sexual orientation, etc., is legitimate issues that people should know in order for them to reach the empathy gap to stop these kind of issues. Thirdly, in terms of transparency itself, and also fourthly about the urgency of the news itself, the likelihood of them to publish this kind of information is very low as given to the like is as given by side government. Therefore, we tell you that it's all these benefits that's locked up on their side of the house. We've been very clearly in this debate. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. To conclude the government's case and Octo-Finals, I'd like to invite the Gov reply.
Hi, before I begin, I'd just like to check if I'm audible and visible.
Yes, you are. The floor is yours.
All right, I'll begin my reply speech in 3, 2, 1. Before I move on with my clashes as to why we believe we've won this debate, I'd first like to point out a lot of the things that we believe are quite appalling that has been done by the opposition, and we believe that this needs to be pointed out to the panel. Firstly, your second and third speakers have constantly claimed that, to quote, we have made meaningless claims that have no depth, and then followed on by, we have no analysis and we are dropping points. We believe this is quite truly appalling because you ignoring our points is not equivalent to us dropping our points. Your failure to participate in this debate by countering our points straight on is not us dropping our points. Your third speaker has mentioned that we have ignored the urgency. But in fact, that is what my third speaker, Abir, has done in the first part of his speech. That is what I have done in my speech as well. And secondly, you talk about dropping points. This makes no sense. First speaker, second speaker, and third speaker of government, we have all talked about balance, privacy, and respect on the name of the deceased. We have consistently talked about our points, adding on depth as we go on in our 21 minutes. Now, furthermore, I find it quite funny that you present best case and worst case scenarios when you, first of all, point out that we are doing selective cases with culture, where in fact culture is a major part of society and the public themselves, in fact, which you keep on pointing out at. But to go back to my point, I digress. You talk about us being selective, but all your arguments have been based, your foundation has been based on nitpicked selective points, fringe points, on pure maybes. You have not considered the majority, the vox populi, which is what government has been doing throughout our 21 minutes in this whole debate, whereas you have picked on points that only help your case and does not open it to debate. You have talked about race. You have talked about sexuality. Okay, you can post one thing. Now I'd like to get into my clashes now. First clash I want to talk about is our difference in opinion about identity. Your issue is you believe that not posting information that directly incriminates and presents the identity fully of an individual is equivalent to censorship and is equivalent to not posting rightful information. This is wrong. You can post information, you can post crucial information to the media without incriminating an individual and basing them off on one aspect of their life. Having lived 50, 60, 70 years, whatever, using your fringe examples such as sexuality and race, you are defining their whole identity, their whole lives as that one race, as that one thing amongst everything they have done. That is all you're focusing on. You're focusing on one factor and saying it beats out everything else. Now, this brings me to my second clash, what we would like to call logic versus emotion, our final clash. You are focusing on logic, which is rightly done so, but you're doing it flawed. You're not adding depth to your logic. Your logic is simply illogical, and we are focusing on emotion. But the reason why we believe we win this debate is that we are focused on both logic and emotion. Why? We have considered respect, privacy, and a balance in both the public and familial, whereas you have consistently focused on logic, on pure hard facts, on pure information. That is not wrong, but you have not taken into account our points, and you have classified that mischievously as us dropping our points in order to we just find that completely appalling. We are debating you and you are saying that we are not, and that is completely wrong. And based off these clashes, based off your false claims, based off our consideration of both sides of this debate, based off us not nitpicking, and based off us considering the majority, we believe that side government has won this debate. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Stop.